if you know the word globalization, and too often we tend to interpret the word globalization into various concepts, for example, inequality, economic stability, and internationalism, and most importantly, everyone is thinking about the same question: what is the future regarding the world? And given the fact today we're looking at the conflicts and also the wars around the world, on one hand, it's not fair for the average citizens to suffer under those devastating conflicts or wars. But on the other hand, people are also asking the question, what about the politicians and what about the policymakers? But meanwhile, recently, I've been starting to read one of the interesting books that I have to say really taught me a brand new concept, and this is something called Cold War liberalism. Perhaps like me, you know the word liberalism, but have you heard of Cold War liberalism, and how much do we understand that? And what does that mean when we say liberalism against itself, that relate even to the word intellectuals? Well, these questions are going to be answered by our distinguished speaker today, who is Professor Sam Moyn. Again, Professor Moyn is a Chancellor Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale University, and his latest book is called Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals and the Making of Our Time. Well, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Moyn, and welcome to The Missing Piece.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Professor, again, as we mentioned before, when we look at the word globalization, too often we tend to think about the conflicts and the wars. But I have to say that starting reading your book, and it taught me so much about some of the new concept, but I want to start with a fundamental question. Professor, from your perspective, how should we define the word liberalism? I think this is a very good, important concept before we can bring the Cold War liberalism into our conversation, because people say sometimes the word liberalism, it's a political ideology, or others will say this is the way that we should govern our countries, and actually liberalism making modern political games more complicated. So let's start with the basic fundamental question, Professor. How would you define liberalism?
Well, so, part of my agenda in the book is to take a historical perspective on that kind of problem. There's no agreement across time about definitions. And people have sometimes been called liberals even before the word existed. An example would be John Locke, the 17th century English philosopher, who's sometimes called the founder of liberalism, even though the word didn't appear for 2 centuries. And then there are people who bitterly disagree with one another in modern times, the last couple of centuries, about what liberalism is when they embrace it, or for that matter, when they reject it. There's been a big debate about liberalism in the United States at various points, but especially since Donald Trump was declared the victor of the 2016 election, in part because a political scientist named Patrick Deneen published a book called Why Liberalism Failed, that was seen as a kind of touchstone to help think about how Trump unexpectedly won. And so I'm not trying to dodge your question, but I think my main response is that it's a contested concept, and there are different people who all identify as liberals who can't seem to agree about what it is. My main point in the book is that those people change their minds most radically in the middle of the 20th century. In the 19th century, those who emerged as liberals, they had liberal parties for the first time. They had liberalism as a word for the first time. They all agreed that liberalism was about human emancipation, freedom through the right institutional arrangements. And then in the middle of the 20th century, liberals, who I call Cold War liberals, redefined liberalism. And they said, no, liberalism ought to be understood in terms of freedom in private from community and the state. And it's actually at this point that John Locke, who had ideas of that kind, maybe, was kind of retroactively made a liberal in the way that political theory is taught in colleges and universities. So I'm taking a historical view, which kind of repudiates your question, but I have to, because the whole point of my book is that liberals themselves changed the definition of liberalism. And we have to see that that happened historically in order to make sense of what we should do.
Well, again, Professor, one thing that spot on is you're right. Because today, when we look at this internationalism or international order, it's rather difficult and challenging to put one certain or affirmative definition on certain context. Now, I want to talk about, again, the title of your book. It's called Cold War Liberalism. Now, I want to read something to you that is from the book that is quite interesting that you wrote, and I quote, Cold War liberals occasionally conceded that liberty might require some kind of equal standing in society and politics. You know, again, when we look at the word Cold War liberalism, we understand the Cold War because, again, historically, we look at this international complication of the history. But on the other hand, again, going back to the word liberalism, how would you put those two things together? Because again, one thing, it's about what happened in the past that almost changed the world. But on the other hand, as you mentioned before, Professor, it's rather difficult and challenging to put a definition on this word. So what does that mean, Cold War liberalism? How should we put it in a very simple way as we witnessing and also grasping what is happening around the world today?
Well, so I agree with you. We should care most of all about the present. And the only reason people like me write history books is just to reassess our options in the present. And the main idea of the book is to say that because liberals changed their mind so drastically about what their tradition was in the middle of the 20th century, with Cold War liberals coming out against the state in favor of a kind of a pretty minimalist theory of freedom, we became their heirs. Now, they were fighting communism at the time, which seemed like it stood for progress and had the biggest and most intrusive states that anyone had ever created, fascists aside. And so Cold War liberals said they stood for freedom from the state. Progress, they said, could be an alibi for the kind of terror that communist states brought to their populations. And so they gave up on those ideas in the face of the Soviet enemy and stood for a new kind of more libertarian form of liberalism. And they went and found new ancestors, not just Locke, but they reread someone like John Stuart Mill in the middle of the 19th century as someone who had argued for freedom from the state, even though that wasn't his central concern. And so, you know, my sense is that this was an understandable development. Cold War liberalism changed liberalism for reasons with which we can empathize. They faced communism. But the long-term legacy has been immense and I think negative. And what that means is that when we have to define our own liberalism, assuming we don't reject it altogether, we could look back at the kind of liberalism that came before Cold War liberalism, one that was less libertarian, more about building the state, more about forging an idea of human perfectibility and progress, because we may need those things. I mean, my sense is that Cold War liberalism and its libertarianism ended up becoming a recipe for some things I think we should regret now. One is economic. We call it neoliberalism. It's really human freedom became an apology for capitalism, not a broader sense of autonomy and self-development. It also became an apology for American hegemony. And, you know, I don't talk much about international affairs in the book, although I've worked on that substantially in my career. I don't think the people who call themselves liberals in the 19th or the 20th century have ever been that liberal internationally. Remember that the liberals were always imperialists. The British, the most powerful state in the 19th century, was a liberal state, but externally, it was an empire. It gobbled up so much of the world. America succeeded it. It had some liberal features internally, but externally, it has had imperial features. So, you know, there's a famous story where Mohandas Gandhi, the Indian liberator, is asked what he thinks of Western civilization. And he replies, "It sounds like a good idea," meaning it's never existed. The West has never been civilized. And my sense is that while we talk a lot about liberal internationalism, it's never existed. And, you know, one reason is that our world lately, in my lifetime and yours, has been not so much a liberal world, but a world of American hegemony and economic neoliberalism. And so maybe we have to reclaim liberalism from what Cold War liberalism made it, and what these kind of more imperial and neoliberal features have meant for the world, which is, I think, revolting against these very features today.
You know, again, Professor, I want to go back to this section of your book. Again, the word called requires some kind of equal standing in society and politics. Even though that, Professor, your book covers history, but again, as we mentioned before, you've been working on international affairs and of course the modern complication of the games for so long. But how should we understand the word equality in society and politics as we're discussing this Cold War liberalism? Because again, you know, on one hand, it sounded great. It sounds wonderful if we talk about this equality can be protected and can be valued everywhere around the world. But in truth, this is not actually taking place. As we mentioned before, we're looking at the wars in Ukraine, looking at the ongoing conflict in Sudan. We're looking at this growth of the communism belief, and again, whatever you call it. But Professor, again, going back to the main topic is, when we're looking at the equality in society and politics, I believe I say this on behalf of majority of the population, is a lot of people don't really believe that. So in other words, we're having a rather difficult moment to grasp this concept. So again, Professor, let's go back to the question in your book. What does that mean that when we talk about equal footing or equal standing in society and politics, and also along with this whole Cold War liberalism, what is the connection of that?
Well, it's a very difficult question to kind of, you know, think about what exactly it would mean to have a sufficiently equal set of arrangements such that, you know, anyone's freedom would be credible. I think what we know and can say very confidently is that we're very far from it. And we've seen, for that reason, I think a majority of the people in the world mobilize for the sake of equality. Let me give some examples. During that, you know, last 200 years, when you had a global color line with white Christian states with the power and wealth, and everyone else subordinate, there was a kind of protest movement. I mentioned that Britain was a self-styled liberal country, but an empire that ruled the world for much of modern times. And at the end of World War I, Japan said we should have a less racially hierarchical world system. And its proposal, which was a kind of anti-racist proposal, was voted down by the great powers, which then were white powers. After World War II, non-white peoples successfully mobilized for their own formal state independence, and the number of countries more than quadrupled. And yet, the wealth gap between the rich and the rest on the world scale increased as a result of decolonization. And there were lots of attempts to protest this development. Now, our day is I think, interesting because we have left things like apartheid behind, at least at, the original place where that name was coined. And actually, under the auspices of what you keep calling globalization, which I would call neoliberalism, there's been a contraction in overall global inequality, largely due to China's immense success since 1980 in marketizing. And yet in many countries, including mine, including China, you have seen the introduction of much greater class inequality than in the few decades after World War II. And so we're at one of the most economically unequal times measured by income or wealth in world history in modern times. And so my sense is that liberalism should stand for freedom, but should stand for a credible freedom that extends like freedom to everyone. Now, I'm not calling for absolute equality in outcome, because the whole point of liberalism is that you get to make your destiny. But it would be absurd to say that an African American child in the United States growing up in poverty without adequate public schools is as free as my children, who are children of wealth because of my, position and success. And I earned some of that, but some of it is unfair. And so, this is really a call for a form of liberalism that is not just nervous about equality because that's what communism stands for. That was the hallmark of Cold War liberalism. A post-Cold War liberalism would have to be one that says we can't think about freedom independently of institutionalizing some modicum of equal standing, not just locally, but globally. Because how can we think of ourselves as liberals and partisans of freedom in a world, which is our world, in which the main fact about every individual that determines most about their lives is where on the earth they are born, which is an accident. And so my sense is we're in the very early days of liberalism. The trouble is that because of these Cold War mistakes, it seems like a lot of people want to throw liberalism overboard. And we've seen that not just in a renaissance of authoritarian regimes, but in the crisis of various so-called established democracies like the United States itself.
Professor, I want to move on with our conversation. In your book that you included several significant figures, again, different person represented different periods and also the political and also the social backgrounds. But one person stood out. It's called, if I'm not mistaken, Judith Scholar. And again, in this book that you specifically mentioned that this person is actually guide you through this book. So again, can you help us with better understanding who is this person and how significant is the person when we talk about Cold War liberalism? Because again, I was reading this section back and forth, but again, it's better to hear straight from the horse's mouth that regarding Judith and also her contribution to the full measure of Cold War liberalism.
Good. So, just for background, I didn't create the term Cold War liberalism. It's kind of widely used, and it was coined actually in the 1960s by kind of radical students to talk about their elders in the 1940s and 50s who were their professors or, statesmen who started the Vietnam War, et cetera. And yet since then, the phrase it's less a partisan phrase than a kind of period phrase. And we use it to refer to roughly liberals who were kind of shocked by communism and fascism in the 1930s, and after World War II forged a new form of liberalism. And the book is just a series of portraits of thinkers who participated in that development. Now, what interested me about Judith Shklar, who's one of the younger of this crew, is that although she became a kind of central Cold War liberal, famous in particular for a Cold War liberal essay from the last year of the Cold War, 1989, entitled The Liberalism of Fear. When she was a young person in the 1950s, she was a critic of the very kind of Cold War liberalism she came to embrace. And so that fascinated me for various reasons. And I try to investigate in the book first, what her difficulties with Cold War liberalism were before she embraced it anyway. And second, it poses the question why she changed her mind. And so the first lecture of the book is actually about her. And it shows how disturbed she was by a new form of liberalism that seemed to be turning its back on the earlier forms of liberalism. And of course, she thought at first that this was a kind of bad thing. And I agree with her. And so I kind of reconstruct her argument against her elders, including a very famous Cold War liberal who was her teacher named Isaiah Berlin, who was an Oxford professor who was one of her teachers when he visited Harvard. And yet, she wrote her first book called After Utopia as a kind of polite criticism of Cold War liberalism, including this particular teacher.
Professor, two more questions before letting you go. Now, in your book, you also dedicate a chapter related to Jewish Christianity. Again, we're looking at this modern political complication, or we're looking at this intersection of political struggles and however we want to call it. What is the significance of including Jewish Christianity in this book? So in other words, what is the correlation between Cold War liberalism and and Jewish Christianity? What is the point of that? Go ahead.
Well, so all of the characters in my book were Jews in one way or another. One, Karl Popper, was not. His parents had converted to Christianity from Judaism, but that didn't matter to the Nazis. And so he was forced to flee first to New Zealand and then ended up in the United Kingdom. And it's just a striking fact that Jews participated very heavily in kind of conceptualizing Cold War liberalism in the Anglophone sphere, but also in other countries like France. One thing I have to do in the book is think about what to say about this sociological fact. The most obvious guess that people have made is that victims will naturally take up Cold War liberal views because they will fear the state, and they will see communism, even though Jews were heavily involved in the Soviet Union and communism too, as a threat. And what I try to show is that this conventional view makes no sense, and that I push this argument especially through looking at a lesser-known Cold War liberal named Gertrude Himmelfarb, whom that chapter, Jewish Christianity, is about, and try to show that what's very striking is that most of these Cold War liberals, even the Jews among them, actually embraced Christianity because they thought as follows: if we go back to religion, even though liberalism had often been hostile to Christianity, we will have a sense of sin, transgression, that will keep people from dreaming too big about human possibility. They will accept that they're flawed creatures, and they won't think that utopia is possible, including liberal utopia. And so what I try to show there is that actually we should, in a sense, care less about the ethnic background of the Cold War liberals and more get interested in how fervent they were in promoting the importance of the Christian religion as a centerpiece of the new Cold War liberalism.
Professor, I want to wrap up our conversation by asking you the last question. Again, this is a question I ask every single scholar and author. Your book is called Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals and the Making of Our Time. What would you expect the readers to understand when they finish reading your book? What is the most important takeaway that you hope the readers should appreciate or out to understand when they encounter or when they, as soon as finish the last page of this book?
Well, so, I'm responding to this debate around liberalism since Donald Trump's election. And the debate often went as follows: we have to take or leave liberalism. It came about with John Locke in the 17th century, and it's really all or nothing. And what I try to show is that, first of all, liberalism is a contested tradition, and it mutated radically, and that suggests that it's not take it or leave it. And so the title Liberalism Against Itself is referring to this period of the 1940s and the decades before and after, in which liberals radically mutated what liberalism was. But that means we can't take or leave liberalism. We have to decide which one we're talking about first. And I also hope to give the impression, at least, that this old history still matters to us, the making of our times, because I think the assumptions that the Cold War liberals made have been pretty hegemonic in many circles. In the decades since, and my sense is that they've caused enough crisis that we should consider whether we should abandon Cold War liberalism for the sake of something else, either a new form of liberalism or something altogether different.
Well, again, Professor, surely this is one of the fascinating books that I started to read this year, especially for the summer vacation. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to speak to Professor Samuel Moyn. Again, Professor Moyn, it's a Chancellor Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale University, and I strongly encourage everyone go online through social media or all kinds of publications to connect with Professor Moyn. Of course, his latest book is called Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals and the Making of Our Time. Well, Professor, thank you so much for your time. We'd love to have you back on the show for the future episodes regarding your book and also regarding any critical, important concept within our community. So thank you so much for doing this.